Hello. So today I am doing a live session on the quadratic formula. So there are two things that you're learning this week, solving by factoring and then using the quadratic formula. Most people can figure out solving by factoring, but the quadratic formula is a little confusing and complicated, so that's why I figured I'd do the live session on that for this week. So where the quadratic formula comes from is from completing the square, which I accidentally, it's not squared. Completing the square. This is something that is in our textbook, but which we are not covering. It is something that will be covered in college algebra. So the formula is in the box, and this allows you to solve any quadratic equation as long as it's set equal to 0. So everything needs to be on one side. So you just have to identify your coefficients and then plug them into the formula and then follow the order of operations. So there are three different types of solutions you can get. You can get a rational number, which is a number that can be written as a fraction. So that includes whole numbers in addition to fractions. You can get irrational numbers, and so those will be decimals that you would have to round. And that happens when you get a square root that doesn't come out evenly. And you can have no real solution, which means inside the square root you get a negative, which means when you try to take the square root on a calculator, you get an error. So there are three different types of solutions. So let's just get into it and start working problems. And so for each of these, I've written the quadratic formula. I recommend that you write it out every single time so that you have practice and you start memorizing it. So we need to identify our A, B, and C. So the A is the coefficient in front of the squared term, which is 1 in this case. B is -10, and C is 25. So these are the same A and B, or A, B, and C that we used when we were factoring. So they're just called the same thing. It's just what's different is that our equation is set equal to 0, which means we are solving. So the quadratic formula starts with x equals, but our variable is y, so we're going to have y equals. And so we have negative b. So I have my negative, and then b is -10. So I'm going to put parentheses around that. Whenever I have negatives and I'm plugging them in, I always put parentheses. Then I have plus or minus, and then my square root. Then b squared, so b is -10, so I'm going to have parentheses around that and then square it. Minus 4 times a, which is 1, and c, which is 25. And then this whole thing is over 2 times a, so that's 2 times 1. So first step is to plug in all of the numbers. If it helps you to color code, you can go ahead and color code. Second step is to follow the order of operations. So that's PEMDAS. So if there's anything going on inside parentheses, you would do that first. Next is exponents. So we're going to square the -10. So I'm going to just highlight each step that we're going to do. So we're going to start by squaring the -10. Now, all of that is inside the square root, which means we can also work on things outside of the square root at the same time. So usually at the same time, I will also take care of the -b part and the denominator, because those are unrelated. Those are all in different terms. So that just saves some work because the quadratic formula involves a lot of steps. So y equals, so -10, those cancel, you get a +10, my plus or minus. Now I'm going to square -10, so squaring a negative becomes a positive, so that is 100. Then I have -4 times 1 times 25. And then 2 times 1 in the denominator is 2. So now I have no more exponents. I want to simplify inside the square root, so next is the multiplication. So I'm going to be doing 4 times 1 times 25. And you could include this minus to make it a -4. So I'm going to have y equals 10 plus or minus square root 100 And then negative 4 times 1 times 25 is negative 100. So that's going to be minus 100, all divided by 2. So now I don't have any multiplication left. I don't have any division. I have a fraction, but that has to wait. Now we need to do the subtraction that is inside the square root. So I'm going to do the 100 minus 100. So that's y equals 10 plus or minus. Now 100 minus 100 is 0, so the square root is 0 all over 2. So the square root is 0. On all calculators, there is a button for taking the square root. And so you want to be able to use that button. And when you take the square root of 0, you get 0. So this is just 10 plus or minus 0, and which is 0. So we just get 10 over 2. And then we could divide that 10 divided by 2, which gives us 5. So we have one solution here, y equals 5. This particular problem we also could have done by factoring. So I'm going to just do that in a different color. So if we factored this, this factors to y minus 5 times y minus 5. It's one of those special factors that I don't expect you to memorize, but you can factor it by guessing and checking. And so when you solve this, you set your factors equal to 0, and since these are identical, you just have y minus 5 equal to 0, which when you add 5 to both sides gives you y equals 5. Factoring in this case is much faster than doing the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula always works, but sometimes it's a longer method. So I personally will try to factor whenever possible. And if it's not easy to factor, if I look at it and I can't just factor it immediately, or it's going to involve some work, then I do the quadratic formula. So it's up to you. You can always do the quadratic formula, but it is a little slower. So if you get good at factoring, which I do strongly recommend, especially if you're going down to college algebra, then factor whenever possible. Okay, here's a second example. This time our variable is n, and so we have a equals 3, b equals 5, and c equals negative 2. So I'm going to just put those on the top so that I have more room in my box to do the quadratic formula. So instead of x, I have n, because n is the variable. So we have negative b, so b is 5, so that's going to be negative 5, plus or minus. And we'll talk about that plus or minus once it becomes important. So far it hasn't been important, and you can just write plus or minus. B squared, so b is 5, so that's 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 3, and c, which is negative 2, and then 2 times a, so that's 2 times 3. So to simplify this first, I'm going to do the exponent, and then I can also do my division or my multiplication in the denominator. So n equals negative 5 plus or minus square root. 5 squared is 25, so I have 25 minus 4 times 3 times negative 2. And make sure your square root always goes across everything that's inside. So sometimes you have to draw it longer. And then in the denominator, 2 times 3 is 6. Next is to simplify inside the square root. So I need to do this multiplication here. I have a negative 4 times a negative, or 2 there. There's going to be 2 negatives, so I'm going to get a positive out. So I have n equals negative 5 plus or minus square root 25 negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Negative 12 times negative 2 is a positive 24, so that's plus 24. And then that is over 6. So now I need to do the addition inside the square root. So I get n equals negative 5 plus or minus. When you add 25 and 24, you get 49 over 6. Now you want to take the square root of 49. So you can do that on your calculator, or if you know what a square root means, it means what number squared gives you 49. 7 squared is 49, so the square root of 49 is 7. So I'm going to start moving over here. This is a very lengthy process. So I have n equals negative 5 plus or minus 7 over 6. Now the plus or minus means we have two answers. We write this once with the plus sign and then once with the negative sign. And so once you get this far, you need to do the plus or minus part by writing two equations. So the first one is n equals negative 5 plus 7 over 6. The next one is n equals negative 5 minus 7 over 6. So you write two separate equations because a quadratic most of the time has two solutions, and that's where we get that from the plus or minus. It just means that we can have both of those at the same time, and so we have to split it up into both the plus version and the minus version. Once you're there, then we can work both of these by simplifying the numerators. So for the first equation there, negative 5 plus 7 is 2, so that's 2 over 6, which reduces to 1/3. So that's one of our answers. The second one here, negative 5 minus 7 is negative 12, so we have negative 12 over 6, which you can divide that and get negative 2. So that's our second answer. So we have two answers, 1/3 and negative 2. If you get fractions or whole numbers, that means you could have factored this if you wanted to. And factoring here is not too, again, the factoring would be less steps. You can see that there's a lot of steps to simplify here, and it does take up a lot of space on your paper. Okay, example 3. Now here, this is not solved, it's not set equal to 0. We need to set it equal to 0. So first, I need to put everything on one side. So I need to subtract the 1 from both sides. So that I have 2a squared plus 5a minus 1 equal to 0. So I have to get everything equal to 0 before I can do the quadratic formula. So a, this is a different a, 2, b is 5, c is negative 1. So just keep in mind this a is the coefficient a, not the variable. This is one reason why you have to be careful about variables when you're solving, because you don't want things to get confused. So the actual variable in our equation is a, so this is going to be a equals instead of x equals. So we have negative b, and b is 5. Then plus or minus, and now we have our square root. B squared, so that's 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, and times c, which is negative 1. And then 2 times a, and a is 2. You want to be careful. The most common error here is that people plug in the wrong number. Really easy to do. So I'm going to do the exponent and the denominator in the same step to sort of save space. So I have a equals negative 5 plus or minus square root. 5 squared is 25, so this is 25 minus 4 times 2 times -1. And then in the denominator, 2 times 2 is 4. Now the next step is to do this -4 times 2 times -1. So A equals -5 plus or minus square root 25. Then -4 times 2 is -8. -8 times -1 is a +8, so this is going to be +8 all over 4. Okay, I'm running out of room, so I have to move over. Now we add the 25 plus 8. So A equals -5 plus or minus square root, and that gives us 33. 25 plus 8 is 33 over 4. Now we need to take the square root. So the square root of 33. So you're going to do this on your calculator, and it's going to give you a decimal. So you have to round. 2 decimal places is usually standard. So when I do that on my calculator, the square root of 33 is 5.744562647. It just goes on for a long time. And we're going to round it to 2 decimal places. So let's say 5.744. So now that has 2 different decimal places. And so now that's over 4. So if you get a square root and it doesn't come out even, you do your calculator to figure out what it is as a decimal. Next step is to split up and create our 2 equations from the plus or minus. So I'm really running out of room here. So the first one is A equals -5 plus 5.74 over 4. Second one is A equals -5 minus 5.74 over 4. So because I'm running out of room, I'm going to just do these in one step. So you have to do the addition for the first equation, the addition first, hit enter, and then divide by 4. So I have -5 plus 5.74, enter. Then I divide that by 4, and we get A equals 0.185. This is an approximation. It's not an exact answer. Then for the second one, I have -5 minus 5.74. I have to hit enter, and then I divide by 4. This gives us -2.685. And so now that is that answer. And that again is an approximation because we had to round. Okay, now here's another one. 2x squared plus x plus 5. So A is equal to 2. B is equal to 1, because there's no number there. C is equal to 5. And so quadratic formula, our variable is x. So we have x equals -b. B is 1, so that's -1, plus or minus. Now we have our square root, b squared, so that's 1 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, c, which is 5. And then this is all over 2 times a, and a is 2. So now I'm going to do my exponent and my denominator. So I have x equals -1 plus or minus square root. 1 squared is 1, so this is 1 minus 4 times 2 times 5. And then 2 times 2 is 4, so we got 4 in the denominator. Next step is to multiply the -4 times 2 times 5. So x equals -1 plus or minus square root of 1. The -4 times 2 is -8. -8 times 5 is -40. So this is going to be -40 all over 4. Now 1 minus 40. So I have x equals -1 plus or minus, and inside the square root I get -39 over 4. So if you put -39 on your calculator, you're going to get something. It's just going to say error. It's not going to give you an answer. Mine says domain error, because you can't take the square root of a negative number. So square root of -39 gives us an error. So that means we have no real solutions, and we can't go further. So there are no real solutions. So now I've shown you basically all the different types of solutions. We can have no real solution. You can get something where you're going to have to take the square root and get decimals. And then I've shown you ones that come out to whole numbers and fractions, and also an example where you get one solution. So those are all the different possibilities you're going to get when you solve by the quadratic formula. You will learn more when you go into college algebra. You'll learn how to deal with those negatives inside the square root, but that you don't need to know that here. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or give me a call. And I look forward to talking to you guys soon.